right, thank you for your patience, everyone. I'm really excited to introduce to you Adekunle Oduye. He is a lead design engineer for Plaid's design system. He hails from Brooklyn, if anyone else is from the East Coast like us. Yeah, feel free to talk to him after the conference as well. He is going to do this really rad talk about navigating change and adaptation through design systems, because as you know, they change a lot. Technology changes a lot. Everything evolves. So take it away, Adekunle.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. It's kind of weird that I'm doing a conference with people. Usually it's been Zoom all day, so I'm glad that people are here to kind of check this out. And yeah, I'll be talking about navigating change and adoption. This has been something that I've been dealing with constantly since starting my design system career 10 years ago. But hopefully I have a bunch of tips and tricks that you can kind of take with you when you're working on your design system. So the first thing I want to say is that the lack of adoption will kill a design system. I've killed more design systems than plants, and the interesting thing about it is that it's the same thing where you don't nurture it, you don't give it love, it usually dies. But there's a couple, three things that stand out to me when I was looking in past design systems and seeing what worked and didn't work. Not doing it right. So the first thing is that the lack of support for color modes and schemes. Gone are the days where design systems are kind of supporting one color scheme and whatnot. Oftentimes right now we have to support dark and light mode, and different design systems has different themes. And it's kind of hard to kind of do that within design systems in this core layer. But as we have grown and support different products, it's become a super important need. The second thing is having inflexible components and patterns. How many of y'all have used Figma before and had a design system component and then you just detach it and just kind of do your own thing with it? I've done that, and even from the code side, I've seen oftentimes where people just write a class to overwrite these defaults, and that was one of the reasons why sometimes design systems kind of fail, is that people is it's not solving their needs, and they're either going to detach it or they're just going to create their own component, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of having a design system. And then last is about the governance process. So in my first design system, we had over 100 components. Mind you, there was most of them were broken, and some of them were kind of not tested, and they were not accessible and whatnot. And it made it very hard for adoption to increase because people knew that these components were kind of buggy. And I always tell people that not everything should go into the design system. Some stuff needs to live outside of it. And having a good governance process is always a best case scenario, because oftentimes people will ask that question, does this belong here or does it not? And I think having a good solution that everyone can follow makes life easier for everyone. So the first thing I always advise people, and I've done this in the past, is you want to understand your users. And usually this is done by research. I'm not going to lie, I hate research. It's actually one of the reasons why I became a designer. I studied school in art. I studied arts, and I didn't like doing research papers at all. And I thought, I could be a designer and I don't have to do that. Lo and behold, I do research a lot. And I kind of believe that once you start including research into your design system, you start to treat it like a product. So you have your users, they have pain points, they have goals, and the whole idea of doing this research is to kind of uncover it and make sure that you create a product that people like to use. So this is one of the surveys I've done in the past where I just sent to a bunch of designers and engineering managers, and the idea is that we had a couple ideas of like how we can improve the system, but before we wanted to like implement it, we just want to make sure we validate it, make sure we were building the right thing. So oftentimes in this case, I wanted to build a data viz library, and I was like, wait, before we start anything, let's just kind of make sure that this is something that people want. And we got some good, valuable feedback just from doing this. The next thing is doing user interviews. So this is funny enough. The last couple of times I've done this, people have, like, I felt like I was like a therapist because people would just complain about everything about the design system and the process. They're like, you know what? I hate the design system. And I was like, oh, interesting. Tell me more. And this is good. I like the candid feedback because like the whole idea is like we want to make sure that people love the system and they could use it. And I feel like doing this, especially like when I'm starting at a specific company, I always learn so much. And another thing is that I always try to make sure that I'm not taking my solutions I've done in the past into this current design system because oftentimes different users have different problems. And like I mentioned before, it's like you want to focus on their goals and pain points. One example I had before is that this one company or this one team wanted to support dark mode, but our components didn't really support dark mode out of the box. So I wanted to kind of see if any other team wanted that. And kind of seeing those trends help you prioritize what features to kind of work on. And it kind of gives you enough of evidence to kind of show to like business leaders and whatnot that whatever you're doing is impacting the bottom line. Another thing I like to do is also like get good analytics and metrics of like the current state. So Figma has this great analytics tool that allows you to kind of see how many times a component is being used. And I think this is super important. And when you compare it to what they have for React, where they have a scanner where they can kind of show how many instances of a component is being used. And I kind of use this as a way to kind of gauge like the usage rate, but also like go a little bit deeper, because sometimes I find out that like people are using the component, but maybe in the wrong way, or they override the specific styles. And I think between having research and having these metrics will kind of make you feel confident about what to kind of do to move forward. And at the end of it, what I like to do is like create a findings report and basically socialize the reason why we did this like research to uncover how many people we talked to and the specific trends. And again, I'm trying to socialize like why we're doing this and what are the next steps. So that was research, and I think the next thing I want to talk about is more on lines of supporting different products in color modes or color schemes. In any given case, you will probably have 3 or more color schemes or color palettes. So you have a light mode, you have a dark mode, and then in some cases you might have different accessibility color modes. And this is super important because when you think about a lot of the design systems, theming is becoming a more important thing, especially as design systems support different products and whatnot. And this is an example of some of the theming work I was doing in the past. Yes, that's a purple button and purple text, which is kind of strange, but I was judging but not judging. And the idea was that like they wanted to kind of have this like totally theme out component where sometimes it's purple, sometimes it's orange. Yes, it was weird, but I was like, you know what? We're just going to build a design system to kind of support that. And the way we did it was like we wanted to leverage design tokens for this. And I'm going to kind of show you like the basic level of like design tokens. So we have like the base tokens, which is basically mapping to the raw values itself. And then we have some semantic tokens, which are sometimes called alias tokens. So these map to specific use cases overall. And then we have these component-specific tokens, which we don't use that often, but in some cases where like the light and dark mode colors are not like one-to-one. Sometimes you need it, but use it very sparingly overall. So this is like the same example I was talking about with MailChimp, where they had like the different color brands. So in some cases, they wanted to have like an orange or orange, and then also a plum theme. And again, it was kind of strange, but we got the job done. So I'm also part of the Design Tokens community group, and we've done a lot of work around this stuff. So feel free to check it out, because always I get questions about what are the different ways we can kind of name tokens and like the different levels. This is kind of in draft mode, so if you're interested, feel free to leave comments and whatnot. And when talking about design tokens, one thing I was doing in the past was like I used to author it like by hand. I realized that that's not scalable, especially if you want to support different platforms and whatnot. So I highly recommend using Style Dictionary for this. Even right now, I'm working on a product that's web-based, but also we're going to be supporting iOS and Android, and this kind of made life so easy for me. Cool. So I'm going to talk about primitive components. These are the things that kind of made it easy to kind of adopt the system right away. And kind of like the general idea of like primitive components are kind of like the super basic level components that are like the building blocks for a product's UI. And there's a couple of them that live in design systems overall. So they have like a box component, you got a text component, and also you got a grid component. And these are the things where like if you have developers that are not really savvy with CSS or whatnot, you give these components and they can kind of build any UI. So this is an example of like what I've seen in the past where engineers are like building these headings, and they're like kind of like being kind of declaring the actual properties themselves. And again, doing it one time doesn't take that long, but if they're doing it like 10, 20, 30 times, it's kind of better to kind of have a component that can kind of encapsulate all those specific variances and colors and whatnot, and it makes it super easy. And from this standpoint, it's more of a declarative approach where it's like, I want a text that has this font family and this size. Chakra UI has a great library where it's super customizable, and the idea is that like they kind of give you all of these kind of predefined sets, and you can kind of adjust when needed. So they have one for text, they have one for box, and I think this is an important one where if you want to add a color and whatnot, they kind of have these props kind of built in. So as the developer, they're not really thinking about like, oh, this is like the orange color, whatnot. They could just kind of say like, all right, this is like the active or error, and they kind of get that for free. Grid is also an important one too, because a lot of times people struggle with kind of creating responsive layouts, and having a grid component, you can kind of build all those things inside of it already. And I found that like when using text, box, and grid together, it makes it super easy to kind of prototype UI overall. This is an example of it. So when I was doing research, I kind of found out like when I implemented like these like primitive components, it kind of cut the need of like writing custom CSS down by 50%, which was super great because, again, I work at an API company. Most of the developers are back-end. A lot of them hate writing CSS, and my goal is always to kind of figure out like what can I do to kind of support those people that like have no interest in writing CSS and make it in a way where they can kind of build scalable UI with little knowledge of CSS overall. So those are talking about like the actual primitive components. One thing I want to talk about is the contribution process. This is something that I've been kind of evolving over time, and I feel like the past me, the contribution process would just be like, hey, do you want to use this? Can I build this component? Like, sure, just add it to the library. But what I figured out that like, if you want to increase adoption of new components, you kind of have to make the process very collaborative. And this not to be in case where the design systems teams should be like the police, but the idea is that they should be able to kind of shepherd these changes and make it easy for people outside the design system, but also from within the design system to kind of follow the same process overall. So I'm going to take you to like an example, and let's say like a designer came up, is like, I want to build this currency converter and whatnot. The past me would have just kind of spent 2 weeks building this component and releasing it. And oftentimes what I realized that like, it's always good to kind of get feedback from your consumers to kind of figure out like what to do to like make it better. So the first thing I always do is kind of break down the component into the atomic level. And the reason why I do it this way is that like I want to make sure that design and eng is kind of speaking the same language. So if you're using a component in Figma versus in code like React or anything like that, we're using the same language like from the props to the actual elements itself. And then what I do next is kind of create an interaction flow spec. So kind of going through like what the component would do if you're interacting with it. So when you click on it, what's going to happen? If it's loading, this is how it's going to look like. If it's an error state. And all this kind of gives you enough of confidence to kind of make sure that you're building the component the right way. And then after that, what I like to do is like I create a component spec sheet. And the whole goal of this is to kind of making sure that designers, engineers, product owners, anyone that's interested, we're aligning about what the purpose of the component is and the different states and values it holds. So in this case, I'm kind of illustrating like what's the purpose, where it's going to be used. And if I'm building this component from scratch, I like to kind of making sure that I'll have some like resources and to like link out of. And then as we move forward, like down, you can kind of see that like I'm showcasing like the examples, and so that people can kind of see like what I'm building overall. And I think this is like the best one, the best examples, and I would say like this is like the, if you're going to take out anything from this talk, is like having some sort of proposed API. I've done this probably like 50 times in the past, and I've always got some valuable feedback from designers, engineers, product owners, because sometimes what I think is easy is not predictable or easy for other people, and it's always kind of good to kind of have some sort of shared understanding and collaborative nature when kind of building components. Funny to mention this, I actually use GPT to kind of do a lot of this stuff, and it does a great job actually, because I hate actually writing documentation. And the whole goal for me is like when I'm building a component, I write the documentation before I build it, because if I build the component, then I'm not going to do the documentation at all. So I always kind of advise people to kind of have these like props and making sure they align from both a design and engineering standpoint. So this is more for the developers, but the ideas are like, if a component has like different states, what I like to do is kind of outline those states and be able to kind of make sure that I have stories for each of them. And then, especially if you have like a newer component, you want to be able to write tests so that if you kind of create new features in the past, that like any new changes will not break these older features. And then lastly, any resources. So if there's any case where I'm building a component and there's like a real life example, I like to kind of have these examples in the sheet too, so that people can have a good reference guide. And then I always have questions about like implementation. This could be from accessibility to anything from animations. And I want to make sure I always tag the right people to it, just in case, because again, trying to make this kind of process overall collaborative. So this is an example of how like this would look like if it was in Storybook. Again, we'll have it in the case where we have the component in the different states. So designer, engineer, anyone can kind of explore those to their nature. And the last thing I want to say is that, like, as I mentioned before, is like people will find a way to kind of overwrite or detach these components. So what I like to do is like provide these smart defaults and then allow them to kind of modify them or extend them if necessary. I found out that this was one of the reasons why the people won't adopt a component, because it's harder to kind of change. So I kind of make it easy for them to kind of make that happen. And there's this thing I've been doing recently where it's like, when you think about design systems, you kind of think of it as a product, but now I think of it as like a design system as a service. And the whole model of this is like you kind of act like consultants when you're with design systems overall. And this is kind of like the model of it, where it's like you embed onto feature teams. I had a case where I was like embedded for 3 months, helping to build like a navigation. And this was great because oftentimes what I will get is that people will like rebuild stuff that's already in the design system. So I'm able to kind of educate them and kind of put them in the right way, where it's like, all right, we already have this, you can use this. Or sometimes they'll build something that's like inaccessible, and I'm able to kind of help them with that. And I would say, like, if you can, do this, but I would highly advise making sure that you time box this, because I had some cases where people was like, oh yeah, so like you're going to be here for like the full time, and I was like, no, that's not going to happen. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the governance process. This is like something I've had issues in the past and kind of figure out like what works and what doesn't work. And the question I always get was like, when should a component be a design system component? As I mentioned in the past, what happened was like we had a design system that had 100 components, and people were just adding components in there, and it was like, it's kind of like the jungle juice, where it's like they had different alcohol, and it's like, you know what's in there, and it was like, sometimes it tastes good, sometimes it doesn't. So this was one of the reasons why I was like, all right, it's good to kind of provide good friction, because again, you don't want anything to kind of go into like the design system overall. And I kind of like have these like color coded, 4 different colors. And the first one is like red components, and these are like components that are like, I would call them like bespoke components, so they kind of built to kind of solve a specific need within like one product view. And then we have these orange components, and these are like shared between different views overall. So I would say like they're being used 2 and more places. And then we have like this third color category, which I'll call the yellow components. And I would say these are like components that are like graduating into the design system. And I think this is super important, because I think a lot of times people want to add stuff into the design system, and then I always tell them that like there's always like a couple things you need before that happens. You got to make sure it's scalable, accessible, and is well documented. Because I think oftentimes components don't get adopted because there's not enough documentation, and also sometimes it's buggy. So these are kind of the cases where components are kind of graduating into the design system. And then you got like the green components, which I kind of will label as like this universal UI where it's being used everywhere and whatnot. And I was trying to like illustrate this, and I like to do a lot of like illustrations with like desserts, kind of like what Val was kind of doing. And one of my favorite desserts is truffles. I don't know how many people like chocolate truffles, but I kind of eat them all the time. If anyone has recommendations of truffles in San Francisco, please let me know. But I kind of kind of thought about like this as a component truffle. So if you think about it, it's like in the outside, it's like you got like the good chocolate covering, and you get into like the inside you go, you get kind of like that, the good stuff. And kind of how I think about it is that like neural components go in. So you have like these red components, and they kind of graduate into like this orange one where it's like being used in multiple places. And someone was like, okay, this is ready to be used in a design system. They're like, all right, it's in this like graduating phase where it's like, we want to make sure it's accessible, scalable, and well documented. And then before that, and then if all that's done, it's actually a design system component. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that like, even if it's like a bespoke component, it still should be leveraging a lot of the design system resources like design tokens, these primitive values and components and whatnot. So the whole idea is that like this process should be seamless because you're not creating designs from scratch. You're not creating the components from scratch. You're still using the design system overall. And anytime there's going to be an update to that component that's within the design system, all the components should like get those like changes. So I always try to illustrate people that like this is kind of the process of like introducing a new component, and then when there's updates, this is what's happened. So yeah, just to like cap it off, the best thing I would say is that like you want to kind of simplify like the configuration of UI using design tokens. So if I have an idea or if I think someone's going to want to like make any changes or updates to a specific property, I just make it into a token so that in the future, if people want to do that change, they can do it right away, and they don't have to actually go through the design system team to kind of make those things happen. The next thing I always say is that you want to kind of configure your components to have smart defaults. So I've done in a case where all the components I have, it's a smart defaults, and there's always an escape hatch so that if people want to make updates, they can. And then lastly, as I mentioned when I was talking about doing research, you always want to balance the current needs with future goals. I think that's the best way for design systems to kind of stay alive and be active, because if people are building things in the future, you want to kind of be able to kind of provide the necessary resources and tools to kind of get their job done and kind of push them towards their goals. Last thing, I don't have any dog pictures, so that's it. Thank you.